Okay, I think we're going to get started. We're running a little bit late. We have a big room today. Thanks for coming out, everybody. I am Jody Higgs. You might recognize my name or already know my face. I am the caregiver support counselor for the South Fraser region here, and I help support and train foster parents and caregivers. And there's also, I see some social workers in the room too, so thanks for coming out. A few housekeeping. Bathroom is back out to that main hallway and then down to the right.
Can I park it? I park in the Toys R Us. Am I going to get towed?
Nope, Toys R Us is all good. So if you do get here a bit later, you can't find parking nearby, you're good to park to a block and a half.
And that's okay. There's a sign there that says...
On this end, I think we've parked down in that lot all the time. Yeah. So I also just run in. I'll have a few latecomers straggling in. It is kind of hot in here. If you have to move around or move yourself out of that corner of the room, we can shift around and do that. So we are Pacific Community Resources. We're a long-standing not-profit agency, and we service all the Lower Mainland. And we work with vulnerable families and children and youth in a variety of different programs, working for healthier communities and relationship. This is our third workshop with Dr. Lapointe this season, and thank you, welcome back. And we're talking about anxiety today, and I think we can just get started. Awesome.
So, how many of you have been to either the last one, I think we did screens the last time?
Yeah, technology.
If you were at the technology workshop. And what did we do before that? Oh, growing happy children. Oh, you're a pretty fresh group then. The topic of anxiety is actually a really important topic because our children are actually facing a relative epidemic in terms of the prevalence rates of anxiety today. We've got roughly 50,000 children in the province who are diagnosed right now with anxiety disorders. And we also know that about 75% of kids who struggle with clinical levels of anxiety will never actually see a therapist or a psychologist. And so if you've got 50,000 that are diagnosed and 75% of the kids who are struggling are never going to see anybody, then you can imagine what the real numbers look like. We also know that there are certain setting events that will set off anxiety and make the likelihood of that or the child's level of vulnerability to developing anxiety a lot higher. When we look at the sort of list of adverse childhood experiences, which is something you can look up online, it's publicly available. There's sort of the top 10 things that can happen in a young child's life that will kind of create a much bigger reality or a much greater likelihood of struggle and challenge down the road. And certainly key among that list is when they suffer ruptures in their attachment relationships. And so when the big people in their lives, the special important big people in their lives that are meant to be caring for them and that they're meant to have enduring connections with, when there's a break in those connections, that would definitely make the list in terms of one of the most adverse experiences that you could have in childhood, which would make you that much more vulnerable to developing anxiety. Now, one of the things about anxiety is that it tends to be a very sort of messy picture. And oftentimes, the last thing that's crossing our mind when we have a child who's struggling with anxiety is, oh, must be a really anxious child. Usually it starts out with, this kid's making me crazy. This kid's really defiant. This kid's really irritable. This kid's really acting out. This kid's really difficult, right? That's normally how anxiety presents in children. And in adults too, but we see it in bigger flavors and tones in children. And very rarely do we see something like a neat and tidy separation anxiety disorder. Normally what happens is that when you've got sort of symptoms of one, you end up at the same time having symptoms of the other. Or another. And so if you have one already diagnosed diagnosed anxiety disorder, the likelihood that at the same time you would meet diagnostic criteria for a second anxiety disorder is 60%. If you have a diagnosed anxiety disorder, the likelihood that at the same time you would meet diagnostic criteria for a depression, a major depressive disorder, is 50%. That you would at the same time meet criteria for ADHD is 25%. Anybody ever seen what somebody who is anxious looks like? They're not terribly attentive, and they're awfully fidgety. You ever seen a really anxious kid put on a stimulant medication? By mistake? Because they didn't have ADHD, they had anxiety. And then you put them on a stimulant, and you take an already jacked up brain, and you push it over the edge. Now, and don't hear in that I'm anti-medication and anti all of that, because that's not my shtick at all, but rather that we need to be making those decisions really carefully and making sure that we've really sort of pulled apart, is this anxiety, is this attention challenges, is it both, and how are we going to treat that so that we don't inadvertently make life worse for the child. If you have a diagnosed anxiety disorder, the likelihood at the same time that you have a learning disability diagnosis or that you would qualify for that is about 20%. And if you have a diagnosed anxiety disorder, the likelihood at the same time that you would qualify for a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder is about 20%. If I ask you to go to school, and going to school is the same thing as me asking you to jump off a 2-story building in terms of your alarm level. How defiant are you going to be? Pretty defiant, and good on you, right? Because what kind of idiot jumps off a 2-story building? And so the thing is, kids with anxiety are presenting with all of this other stuff because they have to. They have no option. They can't agree with you when you say to them, jump off a 2-story building, i.e. go to school. They can't agree with you, so they have to be defiant. They can't just sit and feel unheard as their insides churn and get all stormy. They've got to express it to you somehow, and oftentimes, because of their developmental age and stage, they're not going to have the language or otherwise the capacity to really verbalize very well what it is that's happening inside of them. And so they end up with this big, messy storm of all of these kinds of symptoms, and we end up diagnosing them with all of these kinds of disorders, when in fact they're just a child who's having a really, really difficult go of things, right? So you might have been getting worried by this point that I'm really excited about all the diagnoses and the labels, but I'm only sharing them with you to prove the point that they don't really matter. I write reports with these labels in them all the time because we live and work in a system. I live and work in a system, and I suspect many of you also live and work in a system that requires us to approach things this way. And that's fine. Sometimes when we organize ourselves around those kinds of things, it allows us to be more effective in making sure supports flow in the right direction. And so we're not going to system bash and throw the baby out with the bathwater. Having said that, we're also going to recognize that there's very little useful information that comes out of the label that we've given a child. The impactful information, the information that's going to make a difference for us as we work to find our way forward with a child, is actually to go down to the level of symptoms and understand and make sense of where those symptoms are coming from. A child who is acting out is always doing that because they have an unmet need. Bottom line, you can call that anxiety, you can call that attachment disorder, you can call it whatever you want. The bottom line is there's a need that's unmet, and the child is reaching out and trying to get you to listen and trying to get you to help and making you crazy. Like, total respect, I get it. Right? But it's not their fault, and nor should we be wanting to change that. We want them to communicate with us, and we want them to be bringing to us what it is that's happening inside of them. And if we have to work with a system where we give it a bunch of labels and call it a bunch of things, then we can do that. And then we're going to quickly get beyond that and get down to the business of making sense of what the experience is for the child. On this page, you'll see a bunch of anxiety disorders that are probably the most commonly diagnosed anxiety disorders in children. Separation anxiety, when you have a difficult time being away from the people that you love, usually for fear that something bad will happen that will prevent their return to you. Either something bad will happen to them or something bad will happen to you and you won't be able to get back to them. Obsessive compulsive disorder is when you have obsessions about certain things, and in order to quell or address your feeling of being so unsettled about the obsession, you develop a compulsion. And so the classic obsession being with germs and cleanliness, and then you develop this compulsion for hand washing. And if it's that straight forward and you can make sense of it that way, then lucky you. Because very few obsessions and compulsions have that kind of a direct link. They're usually very strange and very nonsensical to the average outsider looking in, trying to figure out what this child is doing. They can be sort of rigid behaviors or behaviors that sort of look a bit like the child's on the hamster wheel and can't get off of them. But that behavior or that obsession is serving the need somewhere along, compulsion is serving the need somewhere along the way to address some kind of obsession that's happening in the child's mind. Phobias, specific fears of specific things. I have several phobias, and they work really well for me. So they're highly functional. Like, you should be frightened of really gross looking spiders. Right? And today, I've never been bitten by a really poisonous spider. So that's working well for me. You should be afraid of flying in float planes. I think. Right? I'm from the prairies. We don't really believe in water. We definitely don't believe in landing planes in the water. This does not take a rocket scientist to figure out that you would be well served to maintain a phobic response to float planes. I think I'm almost over that one. That one's going to be okay for me. I put my children on a float plane this summer, so I feel like if I can put my children on one, that I should probably be okay with being home myself. I'm going to get there soon. There are other phobias that will not be so functional. When you are afraid of the wind, for example, which was my very first case as a doctoral intern, was a 9-year-old boy who was frightened of the wind. And by frightened, I mean like would not leave his house, deathly afraid, full-on panic attacks of the wind. What do you think his quality of life was? Not great, right? And so when our phobias get in the way of our functionality on a day-to-day basis, and especially for children, when it interrupts opportunities for development because of how it's affecting their life daily, then we become concerned. Social anxiety is an example of a specific kind of phobia. And at the extreme end of social anxiety, we have selective mutism, children who cannot, not will not, but cannot speak in the presence of people to whom they are not well attached. Generalized anxiety disorder is the long list of worries. It's probably the most commonly diagnosed anxiety disorder. And then post-traumatic stress disorder, which is where you develop an ongoing sort of stressor kind of response to having experienced some kind of a traumatic event, either an acute traumatic event like a car crash or a house fire or anything, or an enduring series of traumas, like living in a chaotic home environment, where the acute events may not in and of themselves be traumatic, but the accumulation of that experience over time becomes traumatic. And it changes the way that the brain wires up and how we're responding generally to life around. And so if you have children that you are loving on who have these kinds of labels in their files, then that is where that's coming from. And now we get to move beyond all of that and begin to talk about what actually does it mean. What actually is the lived experience of the child behind all of those labels. And if we were to go into the life of a child who's struggling with anxiety and really try to kind of sit for a moment in their day-to-day world, like what is it like to be 4 years old or 7 years old or 11 years old or 15 years old and wake up with that kind of stuff going on inside of you every day. You wake up feeling fearful about what's coming that day for you? Like imagine every day you wake up with that pit in your stomach. You're experiencing trauma often recurring because you get triggered back into it, right? And remember, in terms of what we call trauma and what the child would be experiencing as traumatic is in the eye of the beholder. So what is traumatic to you or to you or to you is going to be different or maybe different than what's traumatic to me and what's traumatic to that child. And so we can never say, oh, that was no big deal. That shouldn't have affected them that much, because it's all going to be in the eye of the beholder, and it's all about what the child experiences in that. And so we can't sort of cast judgment on that from outside. There'll be children who feel agitated because they're full of alarm. They're irritable, they're frustrated, they're acting out, so behaviorally they can be very challenging. Often because of the nature of anxiety and what it does to your body chemically, it's going to be very disruptive to your sleep. And usually you have challenges with sleep onset, but you can also have challenges with sleep duration. Your body is carrying higher levels of cortisol. We know that cortisol is actually toxic to the developing brain, and so we don't want for little brains to be swimming around in lots of cortisol. It's not very good for them. Because their experience is one of trauma and fear, kids with anxiety will begin to question whether or not the world that they live in and the life that they're living is actually a safe, secure kind of place and a safe, secure kind of life. And so these are questions that would be rolling through their mind. Of course, they're dysregulated because their alarm systems inside of them are being set off all the time. There are children who often feel blamed for all of this, and so you'll usually hear this flavor of like injustice, like it's not fair, things are unjust, you didn't pick them, you didn't make the right decision, you know, you're favoring somebody else, whatever it is. So there's this sense of injustice, and they feel blamed. They're viewed as children who will not cooperate versus children who cannot cooperate, right? And just as you would never demand that a child with diabetes figure out right on the spot, right now, right here, how to regulate their own insulin levels, it's as ridiculous to demand a child who's struggling with anxiety to cut it out, right? And yet that's often how they're looked upon because of the way that it expresses. It's not about insulin. It's about behavior and irritability and defiance, and we just really want that to stop. They're challenged often with organization because their minds are very busy. They're in constant search and scan mode. That's what you do when you're alarmed, and you have to be hyper aware and hyper vigilant, so you're searching and scanning. You're not terribly organized, and you're not terribly focused, so your attention gets impacted. Your self-esteem also gets impacted because you have these recurring experiences of not being able to deliver, right? And then the other piece, and probably one of the biggest pieces of anxiety, is that your relationships are affected. You may love this child who's struggling with anxiety. If we're going to be really honest with ourselves, there are probably many moments of every day that you do not like them. You love them. They're challenging to like. They're crusty and persnickety and argumentative and irritated and irritable and defiant and all those things. They're not easy kids to like. They can be very challenging. And imagine that you're that way with them and you love them. So imagine what their peers are like with them. Imagine what their teachers who are trying to just form a relationship with them might be like. And yet, because we know that relationship and attachment and connection is foundational to how we're going to treat anxiety, guess what the most important piece is for anxiety to work out and be resolved for the child? Relationship, right? And so that it's so significantly impacted by the symptoms of anxiety becomes highly problematic, because that's the biggest thing that's going to get in the way of the child coming through. All right, let's take a little bit of time to go into sort of a sidebar about what anxiety actually is in terms of what's happening in the body and where it's coming from. And so we're going to work right now to start to change our language a little bit about anxiety. And rather than referring to it as an anxiety problem, let's begin to talk about it as an alarm problem. And the reason is that the word alarm allows you to be much more connected to the internal experience of the child as they're working through this reality of anxiety. If you can think of, they have this alarm system firing off inside of them, it puts you in sort of a maybe more understanding headspace of trying to figure out how to support them. And so alarm as a reality in our bodies is something that you need. None of you would be sitting here today if you did not have a functioning alarm system. You need to have an alarm system on board because it serves the purpose of moving you to caution. So when danger presents in the world around you, you have to have some kind of an instinct kick up where you're going to be moved to caution so that you can preserve yourself, right? And so when you're standing on a busy street corner, you should be moved to caution and have a little bit of an alarm response if you go to step out and see that a car is actually coming. And then it'll make you be aware of your surroundings and step back, right? You should have an alarm response if a bear were to walk into this room. I've been speaking a lot in northern BC where there's no cell phone service. And I had to stay at a bed and breakfast because there are also no hotels. And I wanted to go for a walk. And the lady was like, oh, you could go for a walk. Just hold on. And I was like, what's going on? So she shows up with this hunting knife that's about this long and a can of bear spray. And she said, you should take these things with you. And I was like, I'm good. Have you seen this package? This package does not do that. Doesn't do that. So, and it's not just for bears. It's because they have lots of cougars. I feel like the cougar gets me before I get the knife and the bear spray, right? I was telling this story to a friend, and then it became too easy. That in my 40s, the cougar jokes became alive and well. I feel like I'm not going to talk about the cougars anymore. We're just going to talk about the bears. All right. So you should be alarmed if you come upon a cougar. You should be alarmed if a bear walks into this room. That should freak you out. If it doesn't, we probably should talk. Right? And when it freaks you out, what's going to happen is it's going to push the blood flow away from your brain to the large muscles in your limbs so you can put up your dukes and fight or turn on the speed and get the HE double hockey sticks out of the way. Right? If you don't have an alarm response, you're first of all not going to be able to fuel those kinds of reactions. You won't have the power that it takes to fight off a bear. You won't have the energy that it takes to have a big burst of speed to get yourself away, right? And so you need that response. It's a highly adaptive kind of thing. Now here's where it gets interesting. Your alarm response, what's happening in your body that's driving that reaction, is going to be fueled by your belief systems. I have an enduring belief that if I come face to face with a grizzly bear, it will not be good. I have a belief that they're dangerous. That belief drives my alarm responding. So that, if I were to come face to face to one, I would be incredibly freaked out, right? If you have a belief that wind is scary, wind also drives your alarm system to respond as though you're confronting a grizzly bear. So that's where the slippery slope is, right? It's about our belief systems, and those belief systems drive the alarm response. Now the challenge is that that responding becomes maladaptive when it's firing off and no obvious actual threat is present. So now what's happened is that you have a colored belief system, a kind of warped belief system that is causing your alarm system to fire when it doesn't need to be. And that's when the adaptive response, the incredibly powerfully adaptive response of the alarm system begins to become maladaptive, because it's not supposed to be firing when you're sitting at circle time at the library. And it's not supposed to be firing when you're sitting in your grade 2 classroom trying to figure out how to print. And it's not supposed to be firing, although this could be up for discussion, when you're in grade 6 learning math. Maybe it should fire a little. But if you're in a classroom and you're having big alarm responses, it's not going to work for you. And that's happening because of your belief systems. There's no obvious threat. It's just that the alarm system has now become maladaptive. Now that in and of itself is highly adaptive. Guess what leads brains to be really good at being freaked out? Ongoing experiences of having been freaked out. And so if you have a child, for example, who's come through a developmental period where they've been maltreated or neglected, like amazing that their brains will adapt to the extent that they can persist, they can maintain themselves in a highly alarmed state. It's to their benefit. If you're living in an environment where you're being maltreated, it is to your benefit that you live in an alarmed state, because it will have you much more readily able to detect the next threat. You should live in an alarmed state if you're living in an environment where you're maltreated. Make sense? So, total respect to that brain that it figured out to grow that way. The challenge, of course, is when the environment changes, the belief systems don't necessarily keep pace. And even if the belief systems are slowly coming along and changing, in order to change the alarm response, you actually have to rewire the brain. Like through neuroplasticity and repeated experiences with that child of them experiencing safety rather than threat, you're rewiring how their brain is working so that the alarm responding will lessen. Like you're growing neurons to change it, which is why, by the way, it's not happening by next week. All right. So here's how our alarm system functions. We have the autonomic nervous system, and then within that you're going to have two branches. One is the parasympathetic system, which is your rest and digest system. Probably this morning, if you're drinking coffee and eating snacks and sitting here and able to listen and focus, you're in rest and digest. And so your body is sending blood flow primarily to your organs and to your brain so that you can be here, you can be attending to what it is that I'm saying, and in your body you'll be digesting your breakfast and sending fuel out to your brain and your muscles and all those kinds of things. So you're in your parasympathetic system. Now, your sympathetic system is a system that's going to take sympathy on you when a threat presents. Perceived or actual, but a threat. Okay? When that happens, you're going to be launched into your alarm response, which will kick up your fight or flight responding. So this is when you're no longer in rest and digest. And so it's not staying here, it's being pushed out to your muscles, in your arms, and in your legs, so that you can do spectacular things. And you've all heard the stories of people lifting cars and, you know, doing amazing things when in huge distress like that. That can actually happen because your body will push the blood flow so significantly out to your arms and to your legs, and allows you to be able to respond to the situation. How many of you have heard my barfing story when I was a skater? Have I told that story? Mm-hmm. Oh, this is a good story about how the alarm system works. So I grew up a competitive figure skater, shocking but true. And when I was 12 years old, I was off at a big competition where all of the royalty from the world of Canadian figure skating were competing. And it was my first time being kind of in that mix of people. I was a novice competitor, and I'd never hung out, you know, with all of the champion skaters before, or been like on a practice session where all their coaches were standing at the side of the ice, like the people that you see on TV. And I was freaked out of my mind, right? With performance anxiety. And so the night before my skate, I had to go and do a practice session to get a practice in, but also to figure out the ice and place my program and stuff so I'd be ready for the next morning. So there I am on my practice session, and I'm really nervous because my coach is standing there, and I can see it's a mixed practice. So there's higher level competitors out there too who are amazing skaters, and I'm completely intimidated by them. And my coach and I, when I look over, is standing on the side of the ice, chatting with Michael Uronic and Kurt Browning. And I was like, what? And they're watching me do my elements and skate. So I was like freaked out. I wanted to do really well, and I was anxious about the idea that I maybe wouldn't do really well, but just anxious enough. And it worked out spectacularly well because my body had redirected blood flow to my arms and my legs. I was a machine. Like, I was landing jumps and jumping. I went over at one point to my coach, and she's like, I don't know what's going on with you, but your jumps are higher than the boards. Like, I was incredible. And she was so excited for the next morning because I was gonna like blow the competition out of the water. So anyways, I go back to my hotel room with my mom, and I do not sleep well because I'm very sort of anxious about performing the next day and competing. And I wake up the next morning and I've got that like really activated, anxious tummy that's not really working so well because all the blood's going out here, right? And my mom, who missed this lesson in grade 10 biology class, did not get the difference between rest and digest and fight or flight. And so she didn't realize that if she forced me to eat breakfast, there would be no way that my stomach would be able to digest the breakfast. And so, but insisted. She could not handle the idea that she would be that mom who sent her daughter off to compete at a big competition without having given her some like sustenance, right, to get her through. And I was like, Mom, for reals, I cannot eat. And she was like, well, fine, we won't have a big breakfast, but you're at least going to get down a piece of dry toast and some apple juice. So I did. And then I went off to the skating rink. Went out, did the warm-up skate, not good. I could feel my legs weren't under me, like I felt really, really off. And I'm like the third or fourth competitor, so I get off the ice, and then I go back out on the ice to compete, and the music starts, and I'm just like, this is, like, I already knew before I began that it was not going to go well. And I start to skate, and I go into my first element, a jump, and I can't do it. I launch myself into the air, but I'm starting to gag while I'm in the air. And so I open up out of the jump and come down 2-footed, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm on the ice, and I'm skating my performance, and I'm gagging, and I just missed my first element. What, should I skate off the ice, or what should I do? But you're always just trained to keep skating. Even if you forget your program, just keep skating, do something. So I kept skating. I did my whole program. I missed every single element because I was gagging in the middle of them, and I had to open up out of them. I finally get to the end of the 3.5 minutes, and I hit my final pose on the ice, and promptly bend over and barf my breakfast onto the ice. Now, when I ate the breakfast, the toast was solid. The toast is now mixed with the apple juice and turned into like a brown soupy kind of mixture. That mixture coming out of my mouth was quite warm. It landed on a large frozen sheet of ice.
Nice.
And then froze. And there were 13 competitors. I was third, I believe, in that group. So there were several other girls yet to skate. And so then the conversation became, like, do they Zamboni it? Or are they just going to drag the barf all over the ice? Like, how do they get it off so that the other girls can skate? Is it a hazard? Like, is it going to leave residue on the ice if they chip it off, right? So the Zamboni guy had to come out with a shovel and break up my vomit and shovel it off the ice. And then the other girls had to skate like over that spot. They didn't Zamboni it, which is kind of an unfair advantage because I don't know about you, but if I were one of those girls, I'd definitely not be falling. Right? That would have been unfair motivation. The then Canadian figure skating ladies champion, her mother was working the door of the side of the rink. And when I skated off the ice, you want to know what she said to me? She's like, oh, sweetie, once you hit rock bottom, the only way to go is up. Right now, too soon. So, and then the other thing is, 13 girls, guess what I placed? 12. Can you imagine that girl that came in 13? She's probably also 42 right now, and I can guarantee you she's still in therapy. Anyway, that's how the alarm system works. Now, the other thing about this is there is a whole spectrum of human beings out there, all of whom have different temperaments. And so at the one end of the continuum, you may have people who are pretty settled, pretty chilled out, pretty kind of just regulated. My eldest son is one of these people. How he's my kid, I have no idea. But he's one of those kids where nothing really rattles him. And so he does really well. Like when he was young, he played a lot of chess and he would compete. I know. I'm so proud of that. Super nerd factor, nerd friend. And he would always win because everybody else would be up in their heads and he'd just be on it. Nothing got him. He'd just be thinking his way through. He does martial arts now, and he's very competitive simply because he doesn't get rattled. No matter what happens to him, nothing rattles him. And he can decide on a dime that he's tired and needs a nap, and he'll be asleep. Do you know how long it takes me to get to sleep every night? I got like a 47-minute bedtime routine. And it has to go in a certain way, largely a certain way, for sleep to be my friend, right? And I'm a little particular about, like, especially when I'm at home, what kind of sheets I sleep in, and that I like for them to be kind of lined up with the quilt. And if they get like really messed around, I feel like I need to fix that in order to be comfortable while I'm sleeping. Nathan would sleep like on a throw carpet on the floor, instantly. So spectacular. I have incredible envy for people that live on this end. I do not live on that end. I live on this end. And I like to refer to the people on this end as just like more intensely aware. There's nothing pathological about that. It's just that you're a little more dialed in. Now the challenge, of course, to being a little more dialed in is that it's not a big jump to fall off into the abyss of anxiety where you get overwhelmed by it. And so if you're loving on children that are living up here in terms of temperament, they are normal. All of this is normal, I tell myself every day. All of this is normal. The reality, though, is that if you're on this end, and or loving a child who's on this end, it is not very far to get pushed into that zone where we're now becoming maladaptive in the level of intensity and are responding to it. And so we just need to be mindful of how temperament plays into all of that. Very quickly, shy kids are not necessarily anxious kids. Human beings are shy by design when they are in interactions with people they do not know well. And children, in particular, are meant to be shy by design when they are in interactions with people that they do not know very well. The reason for that is you do not want your children to be doing the bidding of an adult to whom they are not well attached. You want them to have a natural sort of like aversion to adults that they're not well attached to. And in fact, so much so that we become concerned when there isn't even a hint of aversion. Now, you will have children who just temperamentally are pretty easygoing, and so they flow into interactions with unknown adults relatively well. But if you watch them closely, there'll be a hint of sort of like a space between them and the other adult if it's an adult they don't know really well. Not so for children who have had so many attachment ruptures that they've become what we call diffusely attached, where they attach to every moving human being because that's how they get their needs met. That's what they've learned over time that they need to do in order to have their needs met. And so to be very careful that we do not want to pathologize shyness, because shyness is a very real and healthy part of growing up. Okay, so here's how it works. You have an event, something happens. You interpret that event, you have a reaction based on your interpretation. Your interpretation of the event is going to derive from your belief systems. If you interpret the event as alarming, then your reaction is going to involve one of the 3 behavioral F's of alarm, fight, flight, or freeze. Now, we've talked about fight or flight, right? Why would it be helpful to you to freeze when danger is approaching? Anybody have an idea? You ever had kids whose coping strategy is to duck the radar? To not be seen?
Camouflage
To
yourself.
camouflage themselves, right? And so freeze is an appropriate alarm response in some situations. Freeze often involves cognitively you're not really able to think anymore. Who was I speaking to the other day? I feel like it was a parent in my office. Yes, it was. And we were talking about their experience of their child as being very, very stubborn. And when we got in underneath it, and we were looking at the times when that sort of sense of the child being stubborn came out, the child was actually in a freeze response. So they're actually so hijacked by their alarm that they're looking like they're not moving, not cooperating, but that stubbornness, which has, that word vibrates very low for me, for any child. Children aren't stubborn. Children have to kind of go to places to survive as coping skills, and being stuck sometimes really works well for kids. And so, anyway, stubborn can be an example of this sort of freeze kind of response.
Is there a cortical response to that? A chemical response, or the lack of?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Like, so when you're in freeze, what's happening chemically in the body is, in fact, the same thing that's happening when you're in fight or flight. And so chemically, those 3 behaviors have the same underlying internal reaction, and it just manifests differently depending on temperament, depending on situation, depending on timing. Yeah. There is also, and I don't know if this is where your question comes from, but there is also the experience of children who have had so much happen in terms of trauma and alarm that they become quite numbed out and tuned out. And so you'll experience them as being sort of like non-reactive almost. And if you were to, in that moment, test their cortisol levels, they'd be very high. And so even though they're numbed out, tuned out kids, they're highly stressed from a chemical perspective internally. Okay. Now, at the core of changing the alarm response is connection. So let me tell you a story about a study done out of Oregon 12 years ago. 12 years ago, it was published in the journal called Child Development, and literally changed the research world as far as the kinds of things that we are highly aware of now when we're working on caring for kids in the best kind of way so that they get to grow up as nature intended. That study involved 3- and 4-year-old children who had been removed from the homes of their biological families and placed into care. And the children in the study in particular were placed into treatment homes as opposed to kind of Gen Pop foster homes. And those treatment homes were homes where the care providers had been trained by the authors of the study in connection-based caregiving, so being very sort of attachment-focused in how they were responding to behaviors and responding to the needs of the children and making sure that they were kind of flowing in around all of that themselves as adults in a way that was really going to work for those kids. So the children came into care, they were 3 or 4 years of age, and the authors of the study looked at the child's base level of alarm responding. So how sensitized were their alarm systems? And the way that they would do that is they would freak the children out, I'll tell you how in a second. It was very ethical. And then they would take a swab of their saliva, which you can, like, we could tell how much cortisol each of you have in your bodies in this exact second by taking a sample of your spit and then analyzing it. We could also pluck out one of your hairs and analyze your hair root and know right away how stressed you are, how much cortisol you have in your system. And so they would measure cortisol, then they would freak the children out and measure their cortisol again and kind of track it over time. What they found is that compared to children who did not have histories of maltreatment and neglect, the children in the study, when they were stressed, had very, very strong stress responses, so their cortisol levels spiked very high, and then they stayed high for quite a long period of time before kind of gradually tapering off to a base level that's higher than the children who didn't have those same histories, right? Now the problem, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is that cortisol is toxic to the developing brain, and in addition, it's sort of one of those things, the more stressed you are, the more stressed you are, because if your belief systems are driving your anxiety responding, your alarm response, and then you are feeling anxious and you experience something else that doesn't maybe go so well or maybe isn't what you expected, you right away assign the experience of anxiety to this new event, when that experience of anxiety actually came from something before. And so very quickly the world becomes not safe and secure, and you're constantly in this reactive state of responding as though you're being threatened. And so they have very strong cortisol spikes, stay up for a very long period of time, gradually taper off. The way that they're stressing the children is by showing them puppets that they've never seen before. Because as human, like, they couldn't stand around the corner and jump out and scare the children. The Behavioral Research Ethics Committee at the university would never have allowed it. And so they had to come up with a kind way to stress their systems. And so as human beings, we are creatures of habit. Anything new and novel is change. Our bodies respond to change as a stressor because we're meant to be then alerted that something in the environment might be amiss. And so they do it with puppets. Anyway, so they watch them over time. And what they notice over time is that as the children are immersed in these home environments where they're being really lovingly cared for, there's no separation, there's no timeouts, there's no go to your rooms, there's no yelly shouties, there's no blaming of the child that they will not cooperate versus cannot cooperate. There's lots of empathic responding to all of the challenging behaviors, like all of that kind of connection, attachment-based care. As the children are immersed in those environments, what ends up happening over time is that their cortisol responses change. And so now when they get stressed by the researchers, their cortisol responses are much less significant, so they don't spike as high, and they immediately go back to a lower baseline. So compared to this, which was very high, stayed high for quite a long period of time before tapering off, they're now getting a little like blip, and then they look around and they're like, oh, my big people are here and I'm safe and secure and all is well in my world, and right back down. Why was that study so incredible? First of all, it was one of the very first large-scale studies to look at how the caregiving environment affects stress responding. Second of all, to change a cortisol response pattern, you must have rewired a brain. And so for it was one of the first big studies that showed the connection between caregiving and neurologically what's happening in the brain, and that the caregiving experience of the child can rewire the regulatory core of the developing brain. Now, if you rewire the regulatory core of the developing brain, you forever alter that child's life trajectory in terms of their ongoing vulnerability to stress and thus mental health challenges. Guess how long it took for the 3- and 4-year-old children in that study who had been removed from previous environments of maltreatment and neglect to change their cortisol response patterns, to have their cortisol response patterns changed, and thus have had their brains rewired through the caregiving experience. How long did it take? Go.
3 weeks.
3 months. It took 3 months, not 3 years, not 15 years. Say again?
What if they're moved again? I'm assuming they'd be moved after that.
That's a great question. Let me answer that in a second. And so it took only 3 months to rewire, and that stays with them forever, provided they don't have other significant catastrophic traumas that will then reset their brains back to a trauma experience. The older they get to be before those traumas happen, the more likely they are to be resilient in the face of them. Because for the young child who does not have an existing scaffold in their brain of experiences to draw on and compare to, trauma becomes the organizing force of the brain neurologically. The older you get, the more of a buffer you've created through other experiences so that trauma doesn't have the opportunity to be the organizing force within your brain, right? And so it took 3 months for the 3 to 4-year-old children. If that study had been done on 13 and 14-year-old children, it would have taken longer because it's so much more wired in, and so it would have taken longer. However, it still would have gone down. It still would have happened. It's just that the climb would have been a little steeper and longer.
Is there an age they reach where it can't be, it can always happen?
That's right. And so one of the wonderful things about the world of the brain and how it can be changed by its experiences, neuroplasticity, is that in the last 20 or so years, we've increasingly become profoundly aware of how open the brain is to change over the life course. You could be 94 and change your regulatory core through your experiences.
Scrooge.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. So the question was, a little bit earlier, what if they experience another break in attachment or another change in placement? Now, ideally, if that plays out with the child's needs in mind, then the change would be really beautifully facilitated so that the break in attachment was minimized as much as possible. The other thing that will happen is that if you can get in and rewire and adjust belief systems, that travels with the child to the next placement. And so once there, as long as there is an ongoing stuff that then hijacks the belief systems and thus then changes the experience of the child, which then means the brain has to now reset and rewire to be adaptive to those experiences, then the gift that you give the child of the rewiring in whatever time that you have with them will travel forward with them, provided where they land carries on from what they experienced before then, and that the transfer in and of itself does not become a disorienting trauma. And so that's where the transfer, the experience of the separation that the child by design will need to experience to move from one caregiver to another, that transfer has to be, I feel like this is a loaded topic. It has to be really beautifully handled to serve the needs of the child and not the needs of the adults or the system, if we want to minimize the trauma. That's the piece. Okay. I feel like we're going to take a quick break. So it's 10:40 by this clock. We're going to get back together at 10:50. I would love for you in these 10 minutes to take care of yourselves. So whatever nurturance you need to give your bodies, coffee, water, food, the toilet, whatever you need, a stretch, do all of that. We've spent quite a bit of time already talking through the experience of alarm, and you've been hearing sort of a lot of chatter from me around that in terms of the answer is really going to be found in the relationship that we cultivate with the child. And we know that relationship, our connection to the child that we are caring for, is their most significant environment in terms of their developmental experiences. That is the field where development happens. The field between us and the child. That relationship creates the foundation for the rest of healthy child development to play out. Coherent interpersonal relationships produce coherent neural integration, so brains that are able to make sense of their experiences in the world around, within the child that is at the root of adaptive self-regulation. Now, self-regulation is our ability to cope with stress, with upset, with all of the things that happen in life. And it's in the world of positive relationships between adults and kids where the brain gets the best chance for optimal development. Now, anxiety has its roots in a child who is struggling for control. Keyword, struggling for control. The struggle for control will have been produced by the child's experiences where life felt, whether it was or wasn't, but that it felt like it was out of control. So when a child has the experience too big, when they're too vulnerable and it's too much for them to bear, the experience of life being out of control, they are going to have a natural instinctual response to want to then control it, right? So anxiety always has its roots in a child who is struggling for control. That struggle neurologically kicks off a cascade of events that produce a chemical stress response in the body. That stress response in the body is going to lead to the child interpreting other events as alarming. And then we're off to the races. And that's how the experience of things being out of control drives the belief system that I live in a world that is not safe and secure. When we have a belief that we live in a world that is not safe and secure, we get really good at becoming high stress responders. So, in order to get in underneath that, we need to make sure that we have given children relational experiences in their caregiving environment with us that reduces their alarm, that buffers their brain against the things that might alarm them and allows them to begin shifting their belief systems. This is a slide that shows what's happening in the brain over time and why the period of child development is so key when it comes to getting the wiring working out for us. So if you look at this first panel, this is the newborn stage. Not a lot going on in that brain in terms of like how prolifically developed it is, right? You don't see a lot of neurons there. By 6 months of age, you see more neurons, more cells. Those would be the black dots. But the big thing is, look at how branched they are. And so all of these little connections that are being made as these branches branch off and connect with other branches, which connect with other branches, which connect with other branches, leads to profound brain development in the first 24 months of life in particular, but in the first several years of life. In fact, the human brain is not fully matured until sometime in the mid to late 20s. So we look at the newborn and we look at the 6-month-old brain and then we look at the 2-year-old brain. This brain, when it was born, weighed 25% of its eventual adult size. By the time this child reaches their second birthday, the brain will weigh 75% of its eventual adult size. Do you know how small a neuron is? It's really, really small. How many neurons do you have to grow to take your brain from 25% of its eventual adult size to 75% of its eventual adult size in 24 months? 1,000,000 kajillion to the power of infinity neurons. Right? So much so, how old is this baby?
It's 5 weeks.
5 weeks? And there's this baby. 6 months? Is there another baby? Or just a passing baby? How old is this one?
3.
3 years. This is coming. So these two little babes, they are growing 700 new neurological connections per second. Imagine that. It means that we have this profound opportunity to climb into their brains while all of those connections get formed up, because the connections will form based on their experiences, right? So we have this amazing opportunity to get in there and do right by them. It also means, on the flip side, that we can just as equally do wrong by them. So now we go birth. Here's the birth, the newborn brain. Here's the brain at 6 years of age, looking good and juicy. Look at the 14-year-old. Anybody got 14-year-olds at home?
Yes.
Adolescents, teenagers? Yeah. Do you feel like they're losing brain cells? I know, right? One day that's going to be you. So what's happening is not necessarily that they're losing brain cells. What's happening by 14 years of age is that their brains have gotten smart. See, in the early years, when we're growing 700 new neurological connections per second, we're trying to make a go of things. By age 14, our brain has figured out what's important, what connections to feed, and which ones are kind of not really getting used or a little bit extraneous. And it'll begin to prune, very selectively, prune out the connections that aren't necessary. Why would you continue to funnel energy in terms of maintaining all those cellular connections to something that's not needed, right? Now over time, when the child's brain gets stressed or fired up, and then we come alongside and calm it and soothe it and settle it, and the brain gets fired up and has an experience of being settled, and fired up and being settled, how many times does she fire up a day?
What, 4 or 5 times?
Well, I was going to say 87.
Yeah.
Right? Like even just now, as you've worked to like calm her back down, which you're doing a beautiful job of. So she's starting to chat and get active, which is her job, and love that. And then you've now got her in your lap and she's all settled because she's in connection and she's chewing on a cookie. Who would be cookie? Right? And so like many times a day, she goes up, then we bring her back down. She goes up, we bring her back down. By the time she's 14, her brain has figured out that loop, really useful. Really love that loop. Gonna prune out the loop that has me firing up and firing up and firing up, because I don't use that one so often. I'm a brain that's really regulated. I'm a brain that knows how to self-soothe. I'm a brain that knows how to manage impulses. I'm a brain that can engage in self-control. I'm a brain that's regulated, and I'm going to hang on to the loop that allows me to regulate, because that's the loop that's been used. That's the loop that's been reinforced, that's been practiced. Imagine the brain that doesn't get that safety. So they fire up, and then more bad stuff happens. And they fire up a bit more, and then more bad stuff happens. And they fire up a bit more, and they just keep going and going and going. What is that brain going to prune out? The loop back down. Right? So now they cannot manage stress. They cannot control their anger. They cannot regulate their impulses. They cannot make good choices. The choice language makes me crazy. It's not that they're making bad choices. Say again?
What if the child's born with a certain precondition? Does that affect that development? Like, do autistic kids have a different development system of the brain?
In terms of which part?
Well,
In terms of like how densely.
yeah, or how do they have a tendency to route the pathways in different directions that are not also called?
In some ways, yes. The other thing is that there's going to be heightened sensitivity to the things that alarm. And so, because the world is a challenging place to be, when you have, for example, sensory based stuff or whatever it is, you're going to get tripped into alarm a lot more so, which is why we tend to see like the big meltdowns and sort of the going to pieces and trauma, really, over time. And yet, the same reality exists where when that child, regardless of what it is that has fired them up, has enduring experiences of being empathically responded to and settled in ways that resonate with them, in ways that make sense. And so, for my son, who might get fired up, I'm about to get in your space, so I'm just warning you. For my son, who gets fired up, who does not have ASD, I would be in his space like this and finding his eyes, because that's how I'm going to connect with him, and that's how he'll respond. I have coffee breath too, and now I'm in your space. That's how he's going to respond and feel the connection with me. If you have a child who's on the spectrum, where the eyes can sometimes be way too vulnerable to go through, you've got to find alternate channels for that regulating and soothing. And so it might be just the tone of your voice, it might be a touch to the arm, it might, who knows what it's going to be. You've got to find the way that will regulate and calm so that they can also, if this was 87 times a day, then that might be 187 times a day, be brought back down so that their regulatory loop gets sorted out as well. That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, the HPA axis. Yeah. All right. So remember that anxiety had its origins in the experience of a child who felt like things were out of control. It wasn't safe for them, so they needed to arrest some control over all of that, right? Now, children view us, the big people, by design, they view us as their ultimate protectors. And so without us, they're literally not able to survive in their world. The human child will not survive if it doesn't have a connection to an adult somewhere. And not just because you water and feed and clothe them, but because you need to love them. If they're not being loved, they will die. That's what happens. And so their connection to us is incredibly important. And if they have the experience of us as being their protectors, then we rise to the occasion, we shield them against the things that alarm them, and we've thus done our job as the ultimate protector. And it happens in the relationship we have with them, in that experience of relationship. So the shield, when the child experiences alarm or something that threatens them, that shield that we are meant to be providing breaks down. It doesn't mean that you suck at your job. It means that they experienced something alarming. Much of what they experience that is alarming will be far beyond your control. But nevertheless, their internal understanding of that is the shield broke down. So they endure some kind of a disconnection from you. That would be a shield breaking down, or an actual threat from the world around. That's going to create that experience of the shield breaking down. That leads to alarm. So whenever they feel like they don't have you, they're disconnected from you, they're going to feel alarmed. When they feel close to you, the alarm settles down, right? Fired up, settled down. When they feel threat from the world around, their alarm is going to fire up. So those two situations, disconnection and threat. The threat can be perceived or actual. It's in the eye of the beholder. You got it? Then they experience alarm. A child who's experiencing connection will not be experiencing alarm. The alarm will be brought to rest. And so that's the idea, is we want to make sure that we haven't set up the world so that the experience of connection ceases to exist, thus leading the child into the perpetual loop or experience of being alarmed. Instead, we want that experience of connection to be forefront, and then the alarm gets brought to rest. Okay, here's where it becomes unfair. Are you ready? These two things are creating that alarm. The disconnect from you, emotionally or physically. Somebody spoke to me over the break about separation anxiety. So there's a physical separation, and it alarms you. Alarms the child. It might alarm you too, but it alarms the child. That's what we're talking about today. So there's a physical disconnect that creates alarm in children, or an emotional disconnect. If they think that you're not happy with them, they're going to be freaked out. That creates alarm. And in the world of discipline, we often play with that and use that to our advantage in ways that are yuck for kids, right? And that would be an emotional disconnect. It will alarm them. So one source of alarm is the disconnect. second source of alarm is the things that we more classically think about as being alarming to children, perceived or actual threats from the world around. Now remember, you are viewed instinctually by the child as their ultimate protector. So if the child experiences threat from the world around them, perceived or actual, have you done your job? In their intuitive subconscious mind, you have failed. So their experience of threat from the world around them, perceived or actual, is internalized by them as a disconnect. You were either emotionally and or physically not available to them when they needed you most to be the shield. You failed at your job. Right? Is it your fault? No! In most cases, no. Sometimes it is big people's fault. Sometimes big people do terrible things to children. And that's what creates that alarm for them. But most of the big people that I get to talk to do not do this to kids. You are living this with kids. And it's not because you did it to them. It's because you are in the role of the attachment figure. You are in the role of being their big person, and yet they experience threat from the world around. You are the only one that can be blamed. Even if you had nothing to do with it. Right. So, if that's at the center of it, guess what the answer becomes? So essentially, we reimagine or reinterpret threat as a child's experience of disconnect. We weren't there for them when they needed us. If disconnect is at the core of it all, then what is at the core of the response? What is at the core of the cure? The core of the fix? The core of getting underneath? Connection, right? That's how we find our way in. Bad big people do not necessarily, as we just talked about, create anxious children. However, the child who is at rest is always a child who is surrounded by attuned and insightful big people. You may not have created it, you are the answer to it. So let's talk about how we effectively support children struggling with anxiety. And to do that, I want to talk first through a few of these myths, pop culture ideas about anxiety. And I'm going to just own for you straight up, my biases are about to become glaringly loud as I talk through this slide. You do not get better at dealing with worry by practicing being worried. It simply makes you more worried. This does not take a rocket scientist to figure out. If you continuously ask children to engage in situations that panic and alarm and freak them out, they will continuously be alarmed and panicked and freaked out. Either that, or they'll figure out that their best defense is to numb out. And if they numb out, have you actually solved the problem, or have, in fact, have you made it worse? So much worse. Now we gotta melt them out of their frozen state before we can get back to work, right? And so and this is what I mean by my bias is getting glaringly loud, because many of you may know that the most sort of dominant, especially ministry sanctioned, and I can say that because they were my employers at one point. They aren't anymore. Not directly anyways. And I didn't get fired. But cognitive behavioral therapy is sort of touted as the big sort of grand solution to all anxiety. And cognitive behavioral therapy begins by having you practice being worried, which only leads to more worry. Now, I'm not saying there's never a time where we would begin to sort of walk with the child and start to approach the things that alarm and worry. But we don't start there. Like, that's not the place you start. You get to that when you have a child who's high functioning, who's doing very well, for whom the relational field and landscape has been beautifully mapped out and orchestrated, so they've got all of their resources on board to begin that walk and to do so successfully in a brain that's already well regulated. You don't take a dysregulated brain and freak it out. Through the world of neuroplasticity, we can see quite directly how this will not end well. Because now we're just gifting that brain the enduring experience of alarm. Slow clap. Not gonna work, right? So we don't get better at dealing with worry by practicing dealing with worry. It leads to a buildup of worry. At some point, we will summon our courage and take on the things that alarm us if we are in the context of a relationship that has allowed us to regulate our brains. Then we can do that, and we can do it successfully, and it won't freak us out. We don't start there. Second, long-term consistency is what leads to real change. Quick fixes will always be fake. I had a parent call me up once. They were about to take a flight to England and they needed their child who was deathly afraid of getting on the plane, 6 years old, and would have giant catastrophic meltdown to get on the plane. They were leaving in 2 weeks. They phoned my office and they said, "Can you fix this? We need her on the plane in 2 weeks' time." And I was like, no. First of all, if I got her to the state where she was going to be functional getting on the plane, it would only be because I had so freaked her out that she would have gone numb, right? And second of all, in order to fix that kind of thing, like, we need months, at least. And so the fix for that is called Ativan. I can't help you with that. We're not doing this in 2 weeks' time because that's not going to be real. That's going to be numbed out kid, which in my view is unethical. And it's fake. It's like whack-a-mole. You could whack that down in 2 weeks' time, it's going to pop up somewhere else in a bigger, uglier way. That which stays in festers and comes forth later in uglier ways. That's Freud. That's also a party trick. The recitation of Freud's.
Then why do they advocate chemical response so much?
Say again?
Why do so-called professionals advocate medical restraints?
What do you mean by medical restraints?
To calm the behavior down that's making them anxious.
I don't know. My hypotheses about that are, one is because it's much more convenient for the adults, for the child to not be flailing about. Two is that probably that's a highly alarming experience for a child to be restrained in that way, and so it puts them into a numb state, which then has them appearing to be more functional. And so if your only measure of success is the behavioral appearance of calm, not the internal chemical experience of calm, and certainly not the internal belief experience of safety, but rather your measure is externally, do they look like they calmed? Then probably you're going to go back at it. And the external calming is likely an internal numbing in the context of a very agitated alarm system. Just my musings. The other piece is that the process is never unidirectional. And so sometimes we think, oh, perfect, we treated this, we got through it, they're doing a lot better, and then December 17th arrives. And you think, what happened? December happened, right? And all of the school concerts and the schedule changes and the late nights and the parties and the dinners and the rich food and all that kind of stuff happened, which created a bunch of stress in them, and so then you start to see them slip again. That'll happen. Don't freak out. That's okay. We all have our days. We all have our days of it working out for us. We all have weeks and months where it feels like it's going okay, and then maybe weeks and months where we're kind of grinding at it a little bit. That's the human condition. The process will never be unidirectional. There will always be sort of ups and downs because life will happen. All right. Some guiding principles that are going to set us up for talking through the three different stages of responding to anxiety. The guiding principles are these. 1, when you allow a child to be deeply connected to you, deeply dependent upon you. Do you hear the word dependent? When you allow a child to be deeply dependent upon you, you gift them the opportunity to become independent. Forcing their face into independence will never ever yield true independence. You only get to true independence when you've allowed a child to fold up and be completely dependent on you for as long as it takes. And at some point you'll feel their energy shift. At some point they'll be like, yeah, I got this. Can you back it off a little? But until then, they have to rest in your care. And as soon as you get glimmers of the me, do, self stage, where I want to do this, then you go, yes. That's where the helicopter parent fails. They miss that. They miss the, oh yeah, you've got it. Off you go. That's helicopter parenting. If you're like, oh no, really, I got it. You can't handle it. Then that's no good. Right? But if you're truly attuned to them and you've gifted them this opportunity to just really rest into your care and be very dependent upon you to the extent that the rest of the world will judge you, they'll say you're mollycoddling. You'll hear people in your ear saying things like you should not do for a child which they can and should do for themselves. All of it's nonsense. Don't listen to any of that. You invite them to be so dependent upon you that they literally, maybe for some of your kids, for the first time in their lives, get to take a big old deep breath, knowing that you're going to take care of it. You feed them, even if they're 8 years old, if that's what they need to be settled in your presence. And you invite them to deeply depend upon you, and then you watch independence manifest. That's the only way. Second, big people need to ensure that little cups are overflowing. So they need connection to survive. If they do not have it, everything about their behavior and their developmental process is going to drive at making sure their connection is provided for. If you want to release them from the drive of that, you must provide more than what they seek. So their cups are overflowing, and only then can they venture forth and grow. Have you ever heard the language about a secure base? Children need secure attachment, a secure base. That's what they're talking about. You fill them up so full that they can finally be like, oh. And then they want to have that venture forth. They want to walk forward. Number 3, you must always be the answer to a little person's troubles, even if you have no idea what the answer is. You don't need to know answers. You need to be the answer. You get the difference? You have to be it. You have to have swagger. You have to flow into those interactions with the sort of energy that suggests to the child, I have got you and I have got this. Even if in your mind you're like, oh my God, I have no idea. Your energy and your actual belief, it's not even just like, I mean, you might have to fake it till you make it as you get started on this if you're really struggling, but your actual belief needs to be, like, I got you. We can handle this. I've got this. There is nothing about this that will ever be too big for me to figure out and handle. You are my little, and I will sort this out. I know exactly what you need. I know exactly how this is going to go. Of course you're having a meltdown at the grocery store. I knew exactly that this would happen. It's what your body needed right now. You go ahead. Right? You have to have that kind of swagger. Even when you may often come into like the big questions about how is it all going to work out, and are they really going to be okay, and what if. You've got to have swagger. And you actually need to believe in the true core of your being, you've got this. Are you the adult? Do you know how to figure it out? Let them see that energy in you, particularly when things are challenging. And at the end of the day, if you're loving on a child and they're struggling with anxiety or whatever it is, and you're like, oh, I don't know what to do. Bottom line, have it always come down to connection. Do nothing, be nothing in that moment that will get in the way of the relationship you are cultivating with that child. When you put the relationship on the line because you get frustrated, because you get yelly shouty, because of whatever, when the relationship too frequently gets tested, the relationship gets called into question by the child. And so we need to make sure that the bottom line is connection. Does it mean that you have to be perfect? No. Children would never survive if adults had to be perfect, because we're all human beings and we're all going to mess it up. Many of you before bedtime tonight. And so do I. I mean, if you think everything in my house is sunshine and roses because I'm a child psychologist and I know how to handle it, it isn't. Yesterday morning before school, my kid threw up. He was so nervous about getting on the bus. I'm a child psychologist, right? And do you think even for a second he thought that I didn't know how to handle that? No way. His belief is, I mean, if anybody in the world is going to solve this, it's my mom, right? And was I frustrated with him because we were now going to be late for the bus because he's throwing up? No, because what would the frustration lead to? An interruption in relationship. And what would happen then? More anxiety, right? But do I rock it out every single time? Oh my God. How many times do I have the thought, ooh, if my clients could see now. But you don't need to be perfect for it to work out. You need to be good enough. In fact, that's so much a thing that in the developmental literature, we have defined what it means to be good enough. You just need to be the good enough parent. You don't need to be perfect. All right. Let's talk about the process of creating safety, which is going to be our response to anxiety in our children. And I'm going to suggest to you that there are 3 sort of stages which are not mutually exclusive. They sort of blend into each other, but this is generally speaking how anxiety responding needs to go. The first is the provision of shelter. And this is where you are literally making the child's world be quiet, so that the ongoing assault of all of the things that panic and alarm them, you, in whatever ways possible, get rid of all of that. And whatever you can't get rid of, you minimize. This requires a ferociousness in you as caregivers and parents and big people. You have to be fierce on behalf of the child in this stage. So this means that you are shutting down a lot of the child's life because it's too much. They can't take it. You may have been on that speech and language wait list for a year, but if going to twice weekly speech sessions is just like completely tanking out that kid, guess what you're doing? You're not going. Guess what, guys? They're not going to be helpful anyways. Because a kid isn't available to learn when they're in a heightened state of alarm. It's a waste of your time. And not only that, it's setting them back. And you don't always, don't go out and dump all your speech paths if you got speech paths working with your kids. That's not the point of the messages. The point is that sometimes you'll make big choices like that. We have families who have to make the big choice of, my kid can't be in a regular classroom right now. I'm going to actually homeschool my child. Because being in a classroom is such an alarming experience for them, and we're never going to get our foot in the door if we don't get in underneath this. So the first thing that we do is provide shelter. The second thing is to move them from fears to tears. And this is the defrost. This is where we're pulling them out of the big alarm responding and dancing them forward to a place of having them feel sad. about how hard this is and how yucky it feels and how they wish it wasn't so difficult for them. Why would we want a child to feel sad? Because you go.
Reality.
Oh, talk to me about that. I love that answer. Do you hear at the back? He said you want them to feel sad because of reality.
Well, you just want them to go from the fears to actually something a little deeper, to something that's actually, they're actually sad about something.
Yeah. So you want to defrost them from the fear to something deeper where they actually can feel sad. And then you can work with that, right? Like sad we can work with, because sad is part of the adaptive process. You have to be sad and come to terms with the things in life that aren't working out before you can cycle into the next phase of adaptation, which is to find another way. But if you just stay freaked out or mad or irritable or all the things that kids who are anxious will feel, you're not walking forward. You're not able to be adaptive.
So we should use your response to, or the response of the woman on the ice rink when you came off, and she said,
Once you've hit rock bottom, the only way to go is up.
it's really the same thing. And in that case, it's actually true.
Right. You will come up from rock bottom once you find your tears about it.
So there is like a glimmer of hope, but you didn't need to hear that in that moment.
It's too soon.
Absolutely.
Too soon.
So that's
And
what-
also,
yeah.
she's not my big person,
True.
right?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it does bear on this, because
You're
it's
totally
really the
right.
same thing.
It really is the same
But it's
thing.
the timing.
It's the timing.
Yeah.
Are you a therapist?
No. A foster parent. We're all therapists.
You're all therapists.
Yeah, right.
Yes, yes. No, I love that. You're absolutely right.
I think the tears go to the heart, right? And I always say that trauma and neglect happen at that heart level, and so the healing for our kids has to come back and come from that same heart.
And you can
place.
probably also, like all of you will have had experience in your life where you've raged against something and finally realized it wasn't going to work out for you. And then what's the next reaction?
Tears.
Tears. And even if they're not outward tears, you'll have that sort of shifting energy inside of you where you're like, oh, okay. Right? So that's where the fears to tears comes into play. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then, and only then, this may take you 6 years. For real, for some of your kids, like total respect to what their brains have figured out and what they've lived through, that this can take a really, really long time. I've had families who've lived in the provide shelter stage for a couple of years before they've begun to feel like they're actually making inroads. So big was the alarm and the upset around it, right? So only when we've come through that are we then ready to take on the things that alarm us. Are we then ready to find our courage to face our fears, right? Which is very different from like day one of therapy, creating a subjective units of discomfort scale so we can measure out how freaked out you're going to be when I show you pictures of spiders. I digress. Okay, let's talk more about that first stage, which is the provision of shelter. So here's our child. Here's you. This is, you can't see this. Just when I transferred into the new Word software, this says big people on this umbrella. It's supposed to be in white font. Now it's black. You are the umbrella, right? And you shelter the child from all of the things that overwhelm them. Again, these are supposed to be in white, so you can't read them, but it says from their fears, from expectations that are too high, from life that's feeling overwhelming or too much change, from hyper-scheduling, from experiences of failure. These are from school. These are all the things that we're going to work to protect the child from in this early stage. Why? We are rewiring their brains. Like, we need to prevent the experiences of alarm so we give their brains the chance to just be settled for a little while, to come up out of the primitive brain and into their thinking brain. If we don't give them reprieve from all of the things in life that are freaking them out, we can't get them to the next stage. And we certainly won't be able to walk them forward in terms of the provision of a safe environment so that they can then find their tears, right? So what will you do? Well, you're going to reduce the sources of anxiety. You want to provide a sense of protection for them. You want to get in front of their anxieties, so be omnipotent about that. I had a client recently whose obsession became hyper planning. But like to the extent of, okay, Mom, when we get out of the car, I'm going to stand here, you're going to walk around, you're going to take my hand, we're going to move to the back of the car, then we're going to do this the whole day. The whole day is planned. To the extent that the evening before, she spends 6 or 7 hours mapping out the minutia of the following day. Like, it's completely non-functional, right? So, traditional therapies, if we'll call them that, would suggest to you that you need to prevent the child from engaging in such ridiculous activities to teach them that they don't actually need to do that in order to be safe. I'm going to suggest to you that if you really want to be the big person here, your job is not to prevent that, but rather get in front of it. This child believes that if that does not happen, life will end. In that moment, your job is to have her feel safe. What then must you do? You do all that planning for her. You say, it's about dinner time. I know that you're starting to think about tomorrow and all of the things that we will do, and you're getting worried that you must plan them all so that it feels safe and okay to you. I'm going to do that for you, and we're going to do it right now. And sweetie, I'm willing to sit here with you for 5 or 6 hours if that's what it takes for tomorrow to be fully wrapped out. Now here's how it's going to go. We're going to drive to school. I'll be parking the car in this parking spot. When I park in that parking spot, we're going to be very close to the door, so the walk won't be very far, and you won't have to be worried about being seen by all of your friends. And then I'm going to get out of the car, and I will come around to your side, and I'm going to walk with you to the back of the car so that we can get your backpack. And then we will walk side by side over to this door at this end of the school. I'm going to actually be the one that opens the door for you. Do you hear what I'm doing? I'm now in charge of her anxiety. I actually am so powerful that I am controlling her obsession. Do you get it? So that she can then just rest into depending on me to take care of her. Now, would you want to do that? Never mind, that's going to take up hours and hours of your life. But would you want to do that for her for the next 37 years? I mean, you would if that's what she needed. The idea is that we will not stay there. The idea is that once the brain has had an opportunity to settle, this child that's been brought to her tears about all of this and how difficult it is and how overwhelmed she is by life and all the things happening, that we then get to a more functional state where we are saying things like, tomorrow we won't be making a plan for getting out of the car. We're going to take it as it comes and see how it goes. And I got you. Because you'll know that she'll be okay. You'll know that it may be a little bit of a challenge for her, but she's going to be able to manage it and going to be successful with it, and thus we begin to change the belief systems around it. You want to make sure when you're providing shelter that you're very, very full of life that's routinized, life that feels consistent, life that is incredibly calm, as much as possible. This is about creating a nest. You climb into it, and you do not leave until the child has shown you that they are ready. How will you know? You'll know. They will tell. And not so much with their words, but with what's happening in their bodies and what's happening with them behaviorally. And you'll see that you're starting to shift because they'll start to get sad. And lots of times parents will come back to me and they'll be like, this is not working because he or she has started crying and will not stop. And I'm like, oh, that's so good. That means we're coming into next stage. That means we've got our emotions back online. That means that the big sort of occluding experience of anger and fear and all of that stuff has melted away, and we are now back in our hearts. We're back in our bodies. And so once we get there, we got all sorts of juicy stuff to work with. No matter what, because they're going to be awful to you. Create for them the enduring experience of connection. That there's nothing they could do or say ever that would interrupt the relationship and the love that you have for them. And I would say at any time, try not to be testing the connection you have with them. During this phase in particular, you have to be so vigilant about that. And the first place that the connection gets tested is in discipline. Timeouts, consequences, removal of privileges, star charts, October 25th. And then we move to the second stage, and this is fears to tears. So kids that are really freaked out are going to numb out, which means that they don't have access to their emotions. Only when they access their emotions can you get back into adaptation and moving forward and finding courage. For a child to be able to go there, to actually engage in turning their fears into tears, two things have to happen. One is that they have to be able to safely express. They have to have a belief in themselves that it's okay for that to all come out of them. The other is that they have to believe that you will safely accept it, that they won't be shamed or otherwise punished emotionally or through discipline for having come out with all their big blah. Now, does that mean that you let them wail on you, hit you, swear at you, all of those kinds of things? Not really. Like, this isn't Disneyland parenting. This isn't like Flowery Meadows parenting where we just release them and hope for the best. Who's in charge?
Yeah.
You're in charge. If you're not in charge, then what is the child resting into? So this is not a time to be like, whatever you want, like whatever goes. There's no rules, norms, boundaries, expectations. Please don't do that. Hold the line where it's appropriate to do so, and be kind. So this is, I'm not advocating for big Flowery Meadows parenting. What I'm saying is that, first of all, choose your battles, because are you really going to die on that molehill?
Like, there are things in this stage that will not be necessary. You do not need to eat your broccoli while we're right here, while we're in this stage. It's not about testing, and having all those rules. But the rules that are essential, the norms that are essential, the expectations that are essential, you hold them and don't, is that little girl not in the room right now? She doesn't. Hold all of that and don't be an asshole. Then there's a video one. Right? You have to be kind, firm and kind. That's how you cultivate safety, at least we're not in a church. How often we're not presenting in churches, and then I say things like that. And it's through the connection that you have with the child that you're going to make sure that they're feeling safe. And so what are you going to do? Well, first of all, you want to make sure that you are the one they can turn to, the one that they know will be soft. You will cultivate that reality and that experience for them in the context of the relationship that you are nurturing with them, which is why in the first stage, where we're providing shelter, you're holding connection and relationship as your bottom line. You want them to come to you. You want them to turn to you. Communicate the sense that you can handle whatever fear comes raging out of them, no matter what. Actions are going to speak louder than words. Make them feel heard. Find ways to provide physical relief from their symptoms. Connect with them. Deep breathe with them. Do yoga with them. Meditate with them. Listen to guided relaxation scripts with them. Do it in the context of your attachment relationship with them, and you will take what would have been a good relaxation strategy and you will make it spectacular. Everything that happens in the context of the attachment relationship is going to be way more potent and way more powerful. So if you want them to have relief from the physical symptoms of anxiety, deep breathing, all of those kinds of things, do it with them. You will make it so much more powerful. Get them talking. Talk about the things that freak them out. When you move from the nonverbal experiential side of the brain to the verbal side, you can then make sense of your experiences much more effectively. Make sure that when they are talking about the things that freak them out, that those conversations are guided by you to end in a place of safety. When you can end in a place of safety, you've moved from the nonverbal, freaked out, fearful experience to the verbalized, yes, it was scary, and I was right there. Yes, that didn't work out, and Mrs. So-and-so saw, and she took care of it. Yes, school was hard yesterday, and so when you came home, we did not go to soccer. Instead, we had jammy night, didn't we? So great, right? So that you end in the place of safety. And if I can give you one very sort of easy source of getting the brain shifting even more, get them moving. There's nothing as cheap or as readily available as physical activity. And 30 minutes of heightened heart rate a day has been proven in children and adults to give your brain a big squirt of serotonin. The more serotonin you can get squirting around in your brain, the better you're going to feel. And it will help to chemically begin to lift us out of the rut that our brains chemically get into when we're too anxious. And then the third stage or phase, which we will grow into, is cultivating courage. Now here, it's not that they're not going to be afraid anymore. They will continue to be anxious to a certain degree and afraid of things to a certain extent. This is not about extinguishing the fear. This is about having them feel afraid, finding their courage so that they can do it anyway. They can engage anyway, in spite of the fact that it's alarming, that they're able to connect with the part of themselves that wants it so bad, they're willing to endure the alarm to get there. Courage is not about not being afraid. Courage is about being afraid and doing it anyway, in the words of a very wise 6-year-old client of mine. Right? So, when the stage has been set with relationship, when we've danced them to the space of being able to communicate through emotion, share all of their emotion, feel sad about all of these things, then we're ready to move on to cultivating courage. For courage to be expressed, this is a key piece. Fear must be endured, which means you're not erasing now all of the experiences of the things that alarm. That's in the sheltering stage. Now we're allowing some of those experiences to creep in so that the child then gets to have the experience of facing the fears and feeling what it feels like to move through and be successful with that. And so this is where we really keep the faith and trust the process, and this is where we're going to allow them to confront their fears. So what is it going to look like? Allow that fear to be confronted. This is not the time to be the helicopter, overly protective caregiver. This is the time to trust in the child's capacity for resilience and adaptation. You're going to start low and go slow. You don't want to sink the ship right out of the gates. You want to make sure that they have opportunities to be successful. And you're really going to set it up so that the little things that they're confronting are small enough that you know they can handle it. And then you're going to champion that so that they have the spotlight sort of shone on the reality that they were successful. You're going to provide repeated experiences. Why? It's not going to work out every time. But just because it didn't work out this time doesn't mean that they won't be able to handle it the next time. And so we're going to provide repeated experiences. And we're going to be wise about that. If it really didn't work out because it was way, way, way too much and it was a catastrophic failure, please don't repeat that. Back up the bus a little and go back to point 2. Start low and go slow. Provide a soft landing when courage is fleeting or outcomes are disappointing. It's not always going to work out, and you have to be the person that they come back to. So you want to be sort of that safety zone, that harbor, that safe place that they can come back to, alongside being the launching pad, where you're also encouraging them to get back out there. You want to help them focus on both the desired outcome and their lurking fear. I really, really, really want to play basketball. I want to be on that team. Oh, I really want it. Compared to, oh my God, if I don't make it, I'm going to be so embarrassed and humiliated. If they can't see how much they really want it, do you really think they're going to endure embarrassment, potential embarrassment and humiliation? No, they're not going to, right? So shine the light on this. Oh yeah, you've wanted to play basketball so long. That has been your dream. You've been working so hard at practicing your skills so you could build up to actually getting the chance to try out for this team. You really, really have wanted that, haven't you? So we're shining the spotlight on the thing that we really want that gives us the desire to take it on and face it, and then be the safe haven for retreating to when it doesn't work out. And this is what it looks like to shine the light on both pieces. You're not going to slay the dragon to get to the treasure if you don't believe that the treasure exists. Like, what kind of fool is going to waste all of that energy and risk life and limb for no real purpose? And so shine the light on that for your kids so that they can see, like, what is the whole point in all of this. And then, to close, remember that it actually really isn't about what you do. Kids don't really care what you do. I mean, they do, and it matters. But what you do flows from how you be. And so your job in this is to see what's happening for the children that you are loving on, feel very deeply for them what their experience in that must be, and then become for them. Be for them what they need you to be. Don't get hung up on the to-dos, the what it's supposed to look like, the how I'm supposed to manage this, the words I'm supposed to be saying right now. Let go of all of that. Release all of that and focus instead on how will you be. Because it is in the being of all of this that you will find the relational space that you'll need with that child in order to be able to provide the shelter, turn the fears to tears, and to help them find their courage. That is all.
Thank you guys very, very much for coming. I hope that you found it helpful. We are back again with Dr. Lapointe on October 25th, a month from now, and she's going to be, as she said, talking about no timeouts, lots of discipline.
No consequences, no removal of privileges, no token economies, no star charts.
That's right. So if you want to know more about that, come back a month from now. And we'll be here at the end of every month, moving forward, right through until May, June. So thank you very much. And if you want more information on support groups, we also run support groups for foster parents and out-of-care grandparents and family right from this room as well every month. So if you haven't signed in, please do so. And if you're not on my email,